Hello, everybody. Good morning. How are we? Hope everyone's doing well from the whatever stay-at-home order slash quarantine we're all in. Hope we're staying busy. Anyways, the topic we're going to continue with this evening, is again cellular respiration. This is something we began talking about last class. Right, we began talking about how it is the body actually, one, absorbs the nutrients from the food that you've consumed, but then what does it actually do with it, right? We had talked about how there are thousands of chemical processes occurring inside of the body, right? They all require certain nutrients and certain vitamins, certain minerals, certain coenzymes, certain things in order to take place, right? One of the things that we talked about that we got maybe to the third step, we got to the Krebs cycle, was something called cellular respiration. Right, this is when we start to generate ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Right, this is like the what we talk about as far as your car using gasoline to get around. ATP is what your body utilizes as energy. Right, so we had gotten into glycolysis and then the actual formation of acetyl-CoA, and then we had gotten about halfway through the Krebs cycle, but that's kind of where we had left off. Now, if you'll recall, right, the last 5 minutes or so of what we had talked about was looking at acetyl-CoA. Right, this guy this guy here, right, acetyl-CoA. Remember, acetyl-CoA plugs into the Krebs cycle. This is occurring inside of the mitochondria, right? This whole thing here, this is all mitochondria. All mitochondria. These different proteins and enzymes, or these amino acids and these enzymes, they are already present. They are just foaming at the mouth, ready to do their thing, right? And as soon as acetyl-CoA is plugged in, now the cycle can ensue. It can begin. But if acetyl-CoA isn't present, then this cycle cannot occur. Right. Now remember, this is not like a all or nothing, right? Or either we are or we aren't producing ATP. We will always be producing ATP, period. Sorry, I'll stop clicking in a minute. There we go. We will all the time, 100%, always be producing ATP. Huge, massive, massive quantities of it, right? It is, I don't even know what the number would be called. It's got something in the vicinity of, again, the estimate, somewhere between 25 to 28 digits, right, as far as the number of ATP that we produce on a daily basis. Obviously, that is, activity dependent, exercise dependent, those sorts of things. But a number that's somewhere around 26 digits in length. A trillion is only 10 digits, right? We can't even fathom how big a trillion is. We can't even fathom how big a billion is, right? There's a thing on saw it, I don't know, a month or two ago, talking about a million seconds, right? A million seconds is like 11 days, just over 11 days, right? But then when we look at a billion seconds, right? A billion seconds is almost 32 years, right? So a million seconds, a billion seconds, really they don't sound that different, but man, it is astronomical how different they are. Now, a billion, right? That starts at 10 digits. Excuse me, a trillion starts at 13 digits. Excuse me, I misspoke a minute ago. Right, a billion starts at 10 digits. Right, so the fact that we produce that many ATP, a number so large, it's almost 26 digits. I can't even fathom something that large. My whole point, why I'm belaboring this, is at no point do we ever, you're not exercising, you're being a couch potato, you aren't producing ATP. Nope, incorrect. You will always be producing ATP. Always. Around the clock, nonstop, 24/7, from before you were born to after you're dead. Right? So the reason why I kind of talk about that is acetyl-CoA, right? it will always be converted into citrate. But during times when the energy demand isn't as abundant, well, we don't need ATP, right? We don't need to generate more and more ATP, right? Because that's what's essentially going to get kicked out of the mitochondria is ATP. Well, what if we don't need this huge quantity of ATP? Well, there's a hormone, something called glucagon, right? That can counteract this, right? But it has to do with citrate, right? Citrate can actually get ejected out of the mitochondria, and then eventually that citrate goes and gets stored as fat tissue. Right, we're going to look at that in about 2 or 3 slides. This is the 4th step in cellular respiration. Right, remember there was the first step, glycolysis, which led to the production of pyruvate, and then the second step was pyruvate getting converted into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA then gets plugged into the Krebs cycle. Right, from the Krebs cycle, I forgot to point out FADH, and right, remember how I mentioned, right, each step, let me back up. Remember how I mentioned, there are certain products, for instance, here, NADH, right, NADH, FADH, right, these are all different coenzymes, these are all different precursors. These are all different molecules which are necessary for the subsequent step to begin, right? For the next step to begin, right? So in order to produce acetyl-CoA, pyruvic acid had to be present. Well, one of the byproducts of that is NADH. Awesome. That gets plugged into the electron transport chain. Exact same thing here. When pyruvic acid is converted to acetyl-CoA, that NADH gets plugged into the electron transport chain. In the Krebs cycle, that NADH and that FADH, again, they too both get plugged into the electron transport chain. Without these molecules, let's just imagine they didn't exist. This wouldn't exist either. That's a problem, because electron transport chain leads to huge numbers of ATP. Right? So remember, each step has to occur in order for the next step to begin. So this is step number 4. This is the last step in cellular respiration. Right, now we see the FADH and the NADH. You can see them here. That's supposed to be a star. Oh, yeah, look at that thing. I don't want to toot my own horn, but man, I'm getting good. All right, here's FADH, NADH. Well, yeah, they came from a number of steps, but one, the step before it, Krebs cycle. Right, that's where it came from. Right. Now, movement of hydrogen and electrons equals chemosis. What in God's name? All right, let's just introduce something, and then I'm going to back up for a second. Electrons move along this layer. So remember, the mitochondria. See this thing here? Right. We see there's one layer here and 2 layers here. Yeah. Okay, cool. Right, if I take that here and I enlarge it, oh, this is what it looks like. Here's that one layer. Here's that second layer. Through there. So electrons move along this layer. All right, so one of the things that we are going to be able to do, remember, because of the fact that electrons are negatively charged, something that's negative and something that's positive, they are going to be attracted to one another, right? There's a typical joke I insert here, but I won't because I think my wife's within earshot, so I'm just gonna go ahead and pass on that one, right? Nothing, dear, it's fine. Anyways, right? There's an enzyme, something called ATP synthase, right? Enzymes. Remember, enzymes are something which are they don't cause a reaction to occur, per se, right? They just simply increase, or they lower the activation energy. They cause that reaction to occur more quickly than it otherwise would. And I don't mean more quickly in that, it occurred at a faster pace, but time-wise, it occurred more quickly, right? Because it lowered the amount of energy necessary for that reaction to actually occur, right? Think of it. Normal day, right? My kids, in the last 3 weeks, being under house arrest, if you want to call it that, right? My kids, fooling around. Hey guys, knock it off, right? Everything's fine. Hey guys, knock it off. But let's say if I then stub my toe, right, or I add an enzyme where I stub my toe, I'm already irritated. I'm that much closer to flipping out. Now they do the same thing, and I go berserk. Why? Because I was already that much closer to activating my anger, right? Same idea here. With an enzyme, you're reducing the amount of energy needed for that reaction, right? So, anyways, with the presence of NADH, right, we can see with NADH, oh, wait a second, NADH, oh, damn you, hydrogen, NADH, all right. If we look, NADH goes across, and then it becomes NAD, positive. What did it lose? All right, it lost the hydrogen, but it also lost its electron. Right, we know it had to lose an electron, right? NAD plus, right? So we know it had to lose its electron because, again, it couldn't have lost a proton. Again, remember, if you change a proton, you completely change the element you're dealing with, right? So that free hydrogen, we see it kind of floats around. Again, there's some hydrogen that stays within the cell as well, or intracellular, right, as well. But it has, let me get some of the stuff out of here. There we go. But because of the electron, right, in here, it's negatively charged. Here, you go look at the abundance of hydrogens. So here is positively charged. Here's negatively charged. Positives and negatives attract. Hence the reason why the hydrogen is then pulled or driven or stimulated to enter into the cell. And along with something called ATP synthase, along with this enzyme, that's what then gives you ATP. Right, so the enzyme ATP synthase, along with this, again, this charge, the charge, right? The charge difference. The fact that this layer here is negative, this here is positive, that attracts the hydrogen intracellularly, and then along or in conjunction with the ATP synthase, again, that's what renders the ATP molecule. Now, everybody check your pulse. All right. I hope it's not racing. It shouldn't be. It might be, but don't worry. Take a deep breath. Get up, do some yoga. All right. Don't panic by looking at this. And if you've gone into anaphylaxis, when you come to, stand up. You'll be all right. This here, and this is a cliff-noted version of the metabolism that goes on inside of a cell. You may say, there's no way this is cliff-noted. Yeah, unfortunately it is. right? But this chart or this graph pretty much just looks at the presence of, right, what can occur to glucose inside of a cell, right? So this is all inside of a cell, right? I could, around the perimeter here, right, this red line, if I wanted to draw all the way around this box, right, all the way around, I'm not going to, but if I drew that red line all the way around this slide, that would be the plasma membrane, right? So all of this, everything that you see on this slide is occurring inside of one cell. All of it. Cool. Here's glucose. There's glucose. Hello, glucose. Hi, how are you? I'm good, thank you. Awesome, great. So where did the glucose come from? Again, if you've just consumed a meal, that's one of the locations. Even if it had been liberated, right, from, or had been liberated from glycogen, right, the conversion from different fatty acids, conversion from different fatty acids. There's many places where glucose could have risen from. All right, so let's just ignore those for a second, and let's just say, great, glucose is present inside of the cell. Awesome. It's awesome because that glucose can be converted into ATP. That's what it does. That's why I'm here. Right? I'm glucose, convert me into ATP, because because remember, we use astronomical amounts of ATP on a daily basis. Remember, it's a number so large, it's somewhere in the vicinity of 26 to 27 digits in length. Right? Just grab a pen and paper and just write out 26 random numbers until you get to 26. Right? 26 digits in length. It's an absolutely huge number, and that's how much glucose we are converting on a daily basis, right? Think of it. As far as if you were to weigh out, now, let me say what I'm going to say, and then I'll explain what I mean. 'Cause after I say it, you're going to say, that doesn't make a lick of sense. With ATP, right, on a daily basis, right, we actually convert enough ATP, right, which would actually be, if we were to weigh it out, right, would weigh approximately about the same weight as what your body is. Now, you're like, well, wait a second. How the hell is that possible? How can you possibly burn ATP, utilize ATP so much so that you're utilizing your entire body weight of it, but yet you are still, right, you're still here. If you're using your whole body weight, you would, in theory, just have been burnt up into nothing. Remember, ATP, right, gets converted into something called ADP. So it's not like, that it's not like ATP. When you burn it, it's not like it just an entire molecule just disappears. No, not at all. Right? When you utilize, see if I can do it. Oh, yeah. Right? When you utilize ATP, right, the only thing that's broken is one of the chemical bonds. That's it. Right? That's all. That's all you've done. Right? Is broken apart a chemical bond. Right? So it's not like, that chemical bonds, they carry no weight whatsoever. Right? So that's why we say, or that's why it's kind of, I talk about it like this. We utilize so much ATP that if you were to actually weigh it out in kilograms, it would weigh the same, approximately what your body weight is. Right? So let's say you weighed 70 kilograms, right? That's approximately how many kilograms of ATP your body is basically converting into ADP, liberating the phosphate and then converting into ADP. That's on a daily basis, right? So that's why I mentioned there's massive, massive amounts of glucose that we are utilizing on a daily basis. So, first steps. Glucose. Get my pointer. Cool. Glucose here. Glucose is going to Oops. There we go. First step. Glucose gets converted into glucose 6-phosphate. No, you do not need to know every single one of these steps in glycolysis. Nope. Again, at one point in my life, I don't care to talk about it, I was in a dark place. I could do that. Could I anymore? Not proud of it, probably, but I'm sure as hell not going to try. Anyways, glucose becomes glucose 6-phosphate. Right, glucose 6-phosphate. Now, we've got two fates. One of two things. Hey, get off the screen. There we go. One of two fates. Glucose 6-phosphate can convert into something called glucose 1-phosphate. Or glucose 6-phosphate can continue onward to fructose 6-phosphate. Now, the reason why I specifically point these out is because of the fact, if we look at this path here, right, to glucose 1-phosphate, this is essentially kind of the gateway, right? Essentially the trap door into the storage of glucose, right? If glucose has gone this way and it's converted into glucose 1-phosphate, that means we've got an abundance and we need to start storing some. Right? So that's where it becomes glycogen. Remember, glycogen, that's the storage form of glucose, one of the storage forms of glucose. All right. Or secondly, something else that can occur to glucose. Right? We talk about, now I'm just going to kind of jump ahead. I'm just going to jump across the screen for a second. Over here, triacylglycerol, fatty acids, glycerol, fatty acid, right? Over here, right? This is what we are talking about, or this is where fats, adipose tissue, right? That's where this is going to occur. Now, there's a number of ways that we can arrive to basically becoming a fat. When we look down here, right? So if we, again, glucose 1-phosphate, following it down to glycogen here, but again, keeping with the fatty acids, right? That was way over here, the production of adipose tissue. Right. Down here, when we continue on, there's a step, mainly right from fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. This step, it is generally considered irreversible, meaning like once we have the conversion of fructose 6-phosphate into fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, this is something where we can't just kind of backtrack to, you know what, there's insufficient levels of ATP, or there's sufficient levels of ATP. We don't need to continue producing ATP, so we can all of a sudden just kind of backtrack and kick the glucose back out of the cell. That's not the way that it works. Right? That's not something we can do. So when this happens, I think that next what can happen is the conversion of glycerol 3-phosphate to glycerone phosphate. Now, why this is important is because this is where essentially where we start to have the increase or the process of what's called lipogenesis actually occur. Right. So here, when we talk about insulin, it can increase glycogenesis. Yeah, it increases the storage or the production of glycogen. Awesome. Oh, it also increases lipogenesis. All right, it does. Right. This is one of the first steps where we can actually start to kind of kind of start to funnel or shunt what was glucose into becoming adipose tissue. Right here, glycerol phosphate, could be C, follows this track all the way up here, all the way across, and all the way into fatty acids, i.e. into adipose tissue. Okay. So, is that the only way? No, that's the one way I'm going to show you now. We'll look at another way here in just a moment. But let's say if I continue onwards down through glycolysis. Now, again, remember, I do not need you to memorize every single one of these steps, not at all. But at the end of glycolysis, here's where we have the pyruvate. Awesome. That pyruvate, we see, gets shunted into the mitochondria and converted into acetyl-CoA. Awesome. That acetyl-CoA then gets shunted into the Krebs cycle. Now when that happens, the Krebs cycle can just continue around and around and around we go. Right? Where it'll stop, you never know. I had to do it. You were all thinking it. Don't even BS me. Everyone was thinking about it. Right? Now, one of the things, so if we pull acetyl-CoA, then the Krebs cycle will halt. Right? If we pull acetyl-CoA, then you can. If you pull fuel from your car, it's not going to run. Doesn't matter what you do to it. Right? So if we could hypothetically pull acetyl-CoA entirely out of the Krebs cycle of all cells, ATP would cease to, begin. I mean, really, to any appreciable quantity. I mean, through glycolysis, over here, we're going to produce a very small amount, but nowhere near enough to sustain us, right? So one of the things that the body can do, right, where there was two hormones. So insulin led to the increase in lipogenesis, increase in glycogenesis, right? Insulin's job is to reduce, right, blood glucose. That's what it's meant to do. That's what I'm doing. Well, you got to think about it one step further. If I'm insulin, my job is to decrease blood glucose. If I were active, if I were exercising, would I need more or less ATP? Just take 8 seconds to think about it. I hope you only need about a second and a half to think about it, but you've got 3 seconds left nonetheless. If you were exercising, yes, you would need more ATP. You would want huge quantities of ATP. Your body, with epinephrine, with adrenaline, you would not be releasing, or with the amount of adrenaline, right, and the different hormones you're releasing through exercise, you want to increase blood glucose levels, right? Because you want to have a plentiful source of glucose in the blood in order for your body to metabolize it into ATP. Cool. Well, with insulin, something else that it can do, right? We can see insulin's here. All the way up. I'm trying to walk the line. Oh, yet another way that we can have insulin actually, causing lipogenesis, right? And actually shunts, instead of the mitochondria continuing to produce ATP, can actually shunt and cause those stores to be to be kicked out of the mitochondria and to eventually enter into the again, fatty acid cycle, or the production of adipose tissue. Glucagon can actually do the same thing, right? But its purpose, its reason is a bit different. Glucagon is a hormone, which, again, it just like insulin is released from the pancreatic islets or the islets of Langerhans. Glucagon functions to increase blood glucose levels. So if blood glucose levels are low or they're lowering, just like, oh, if blood calcium levels were too low, we can steal it from the bone. Awesome. Well, think of, all right, what's the mitochondria? What's the Krebs cycle? What is that stealing, or what is that converting? Right? Oh, what was glucose? So glucagon can actually cause, remember, citrate? Oh, geez. Citrate. Remember, this is, we talked about, pyruvate produced in glycolysis, eventually gets plugged in, becomes acetyl-CoA. Right? Acetyl-CoA, along with citrate synthase, become citrate. Glucagon actually causes the ejection of citrate. Right? So when you have glucagon present, citrate is actually caused to eject from the cell. Right? When that happens, and when acetyl-CoA, or when citrate is ejected from the cell, that citrate can actually then be converted back into acetyl-CoA. Now, when we have that acetyl-CoA, come on, Mark, there we go. Acetyl-CoA can then become fatty acids. Right. Those fatty acids can then in turn be, again, through gluconeogenesis, can be converted back into glucose molecules. Right. So there is a very fine regulation of all of these steps, right? And that's why we talk about, right, I mentioned this before in class, right? Almost half, just under, maybe about 40% of the ATP that you utilize on a daily basis goes towards maintaining the sodium-potassium pumps. Those sodium-potassium pumps are what keep your cells at rest. So, in essence, almost half the energy your body utilizes on a daily basis function to actually prevent unwanted movements and unwanted secretions and unwanted activity. So you kind of think about it, we burn almost as much energy to not do anything than we do by doing stuff. Yeah, the body's awesome. Just really, I don't know. Somebody was drunk when they created the body. I'm convinced of it. Not going all religious or spiritual and stuff like that, but man, it's crazy. It really is. Just anyways. The next step, though, once we've gotten through, right, the Krebs cycle, once we've gotten through the TCA cycle, step number 4, that's where we look at the electron transport chain. That was this guy here, right? This thing here that we talked about. Right. That's where it occurs, right here, right along the membrane of the actual mitochondria itself. That's where the bulk, right, the 26 to 28 ATP are produced. Again, that produces around 13 to 14 times the number that glycolysis does as far as a net gain. So we see, right, each molecule, right around 30 molecules of ATP. Right. We can see, utilize 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water. Right. This is why, again, we produce water, or I wouldn't say produce, convert water as well as CO2. On a daily basis around the clock, we are just constantly producing CO2. So it has to be gotten rid of. Now, in saying that, we actually, the minority of carbon dioxide do we actually eliminate through the lungs. The majority of it actually goes towards maintaining the balance inside of the body, specifically the blood, right? Something called carbonic acid. So the bulk of carbon dioxide is, right, highly, highly beneficial, right? It's just that when it begins to accumulate, that's when it becomes problematic. Anybody know this movie? Anyone? This is, I can tell you what, with quarantine, this is about what it's starting to look like. I tell you, man. But Dodgeball, if you haven't seen it, came out in 2004. Fantastic. Vince Vaughn and Ben Stiller. Great, great movie. Hysterical. Rip Torn as well. You know, God bless him. Anyways. So what happens when we eat too much? Right. Now, I say when we eat too much, it's not always when you've eaten too much. Right. Sure. For sure, you can have, different conditions, right? Different liver pathologies, diabetes, that sort of thing. But by and large, the reason why we begin to store too much, well, the reason why you would begin to store, glycogen or adipose tissue is because energy levels are abundant, right? ATP is abundant. We have too many ATP. We have too much energy on hand. So if you have too much energy on hand, you are then going to start to store said energy. So there's the two fates. One, we can store it as glycogen, or two, we can store it as adipose tissue. Remember that one step I pointed out to you, right? Glucose. Glucose becomes glucose 6-phosphate. Awesome. It was a horrible arrow, but that's all right. Glucose 6-phosphate, from there, it can continue on to glycolysis, or that glucose 6-phosphate can become glucose 1-phosphate. Now, when that happens, right, the next step, there's two enzymes, glycogen phosphorylase and glycogen synthase. Glycogen synthase, so synthesis of glycogen, that's where glycogen's then stored in the liver, skeletal muscle, kidneys, predominantly the liver and skeletal muscle, a little bit in the kidneys. In the same token, we can also convert this glycogen we can also convert that glycogen back into glycogen 1-phosphate, back into glucose 6, then back into glucose itself. Glucagon is a hormone which will stimulate this. So is epinephrine. I'm just going to write epi. Right, both of those hormones will stimulate the conversion of glycogen back into glucose 1P, into glucose 6P, and then back into glucose. Right, because again, right, that's with glucagon, the whole function of glucagon is to increase blood glucose. Well, the whole function of epinephrine is to make glucose highly abundant in the bloodstream. Why? Well, epinephrine. Somebody to scare the crap out of you. You see a bear. You see some sort of threatening event. Your heart starts racing. You start to run. Your muscles, who knew? They require massive amounts of energy in order for you to run. So that energy, especially that quick duration energy, right, that's all being driven from glucose. So we have to have glucose plentiful and abundant in the blood, and epinephrine can cause that to happen. Now, not all cells have both these enzymes. Right? Skeletal muscle, right? So here, liver, skeletal muscle. Kidneys a little bit, and it's really, it's pretty negligible comparatively, right, to the liver and skeletal muscle. The liver, again, the liver is a sharer, right? For instance, if blood glucose levels are low, your liver will release glycogen in order to elevate glucose. Your skeletal muscle is a hoarder, right? Your skeletal muscle will only utilize the stored glycogen for itself. Right? Your skeletal muscle will not actually utilize, right? Your skeletal muscle does not have the ability, because of the lack of the enzyme, or the glycogen phosphorylase, that doesn't actually contain that enzyme. So if skeletal muscle, right, for instance, if skeletal muscle, there we go. Skeletal muscle doesn't have this. If it doesn't have this, then if skeletal muscle does not have glycogen phosphorylase, it cannot convert glycogen back into glucose 1P. This doesn't happen. Right, so skeletal muscle, again, it's a hoarder. It holds on to that glucose or that glycogen for itself. And again, that it kind of makes sense, right? Our skeletal muscles use the abundance of ATP. They in order to produce the force that our skeletal muscles do, they utilize massive numbers, massive amounts of ATP. Right, a single muscle cell, right, for a contraction, it uses upwards of 600 million ATP. Right, not just a single muscle cell. Right, so the skeletal muscle needs to retain this glycogen for its own benefit. So, food consumed at too high a rate for glycogenesis leads to fat deposition. All right, so food consumed too high of a rate for glycogenesis. Yeah, the production of glycogen. We've talked about this. I talked about it before in the first presentation. I talked about it a little bit in this presentation as well. Glycogen is just a benign, harmless energy store, right? There's the certain conditions where people have the inability to actually liberate or break free the glycogen from the liver, and they don't go into liver failure, right? Their livers are, huge, right? But their livers, they're not going into liver failure, right? It's when that increased energy gets converted into fat tissue, right? That's where it starts to become problematic. So if the rate in which, and it's not so much I guess I should probably reword that. It's not so much when food consumed at too high of a rate, because let's say if it were kale, you could probably eat kale at, as fast as you wanted, and it would never get, converted into lipogenesis. So perhaps I need to reword that. But, when food is consumed at too high of a caloric rate, right? Because you could, if you're eating an entire cake and it took you half an hour, that's obviously much more detrimental than if you ate a head of broccoli and it took you 2 minutes, right? So at too high of a caloric rate, that's where fat deposition or lipogenesis begins to occur. Right? So deviations can occur along the cellular respiration pathway, which lead to fatty acid synthesis and may ultimately lead to adipose tissue. I'm not going to belabor these points because I actually already covered these a moment ago. But here, right, glycerone phosphate, excuse me, that's where you follow this up. I'm not going to, but follow it all, and the hell with it. Right, follow it all the way around. That's where it eventually gets converted into fatty acids. Same thing here, right, with citrate. Getting kicked out. Eventually that citrate, acetyl-CoA, eventually that too gets converted into fatty acid. We covered that 5 minutes ago, so I'm not going to belabor the point. I'm going to move on. So if blood glucose levels are low, how does the body respond? Take about 10 seconds and think about it. By elevating the amount of glucose circulating in the blood. Yeah, it's that simple. That's simple, right? But how, right? It's not so much that, man, duh, obviously, but how does it actually do that? Right, a moment ago, we talked about how glucagon, the hormone glucagon, can cause glycogen to get converted back into glucose 1-phosphate, back into glucose 6-phosphate, and then eventually back into glucose. So can epinephrine. Right, those are two hormones which can do that, and they do. So we can liberate glycogen. That's something called glycogenolysis, right? Glycogen lysis breakdowns, the breakdown of glycogen. Cool. turning molecules into glucose. Okay, glucose, neo, new, genesis, generation, so the generation of new glucose. All right. So glycogen is the storage form of glucose, right? The glucose can be stored as glycogen. When we break apart the glycogen, we release the glucose back into the blood. Cool. So which hormones stimulate this? Well, two we already talked about. Glucagon, epinephrine. Right? Which ones inhibit this? Well, insulin, for instance. Right? Insulin would be a hormone, which, right, insulin's function is to reduce blood glucose levels. So would we want glycogen to be being converted into glucose? No. Right? So insulin is going to inhibit this. The process of gluconeogenesis. We see glucose being formed from non-carbohydrate sources, amino acids, glycerol, lactic acid. Yeah, with amino acids. Right. Gluconeogenesis, again, that is the generation of glucose from essentially non-glucose sources. Right, lactic acid. Right, certain amino acids, especially one called alanine. Right, glycerol. From the fatty acid, right, there's a glycerol head and the three fatty acid tails. Right, that glycerol head, right, the alanine, right, the lactic acid, they can all be converted into glucose. Right, cortisol is a hormone which will stimulate this. Right, remember, cortisol specifically is going to stimulate the production of amino acids, or the gluconeogenesis of amino acids. Right, glucagon, right, epinephrine, they could also stimulate this as well. Right, something that wouldn't. Again, insulin would inhibit this. Insulin would not stimulate this, would inhibit this. Right, and why? Because this leads to elevated glucose levels. This leads to elevating glucose levels. That is the exact opposite of what insulin is trying to achieve. So what happens to all the fats that you eat? Right. So avocado, why the pit's left in there, I couldn't tell you. Nice little sausage, beans, egg. I don't know what the hell that is. I don't know what that is. I'm not really sure what that Canadian bacon. I don't really know what's on this plate. So anyways, what happens to the fats we eat? Right? We talked about, right, the introduction, right? The first thing we looked at was talking about carbohydrate metabolism. How is it we get those carbohydrates from the intestinal lumen into the body, and then what actually happens to them? All right. Fats, lipids. And we see fats or lipids are lipid soluble, therefore don't require a transporter to travel through the intestinal wall. And here's the intestinal wall, this right gray hash mark or dashed line. All right, so these lipids enter through the wall. Now, depending on what fatty acid it is, it may be converted right into glucose. Right. However, for some of those that are not, right, the large chain fatty acids, for instance, right, they get converted into, or they get absorbed via these lacteals. Again, we covered that in digestion. That would have been two presentations ago, I believe. Now, once they're in the blood, right, or the lacteals, doesn't really matter. We see once absorbed, fats must piggyback onto a protein. Therefore, they're then called a lipoprotein. Why? Because fats are not water soluble. Right? So because of the fact that they are not water soluble, they've got to have something which allows me to travel through this aqueous water unhindered. Right? So that's why they then piggyback onto that protein, and that's where they are then allowed, or able to actually travel through the water, or the blood. Now, lipoproteins. again, we've heard these things before, even if you're like, I've never heard of them before. Again, cholesterol. That's what we're talking about, right? HDL, high density lipoprotein. LDL, low density lipoprotein. VLDL, very low density lipoprotein, right? So these are what we're actually talking about when we talk about lipoproteins. We're talking about cholesterol. So there are different types of cholesterol, right? We'll kind of go up here, and I put it in a really nice smiley face, right? What we see, HDL, high density lipoproteins. We see this essentially is a scavenger, right? Excess cholesterol from cells, and it drives it back to the liver, right? That's literally what HDL does, right? You could literally not have too much HDL, right? Like HDL, like the higher HDL, the better. This stuff positively impacts your heart disease risk, right? So when I say positive, I mean, yeah, it literally negates your heart disease risk, right? The higher your HDL, right? Because of the fact that it literally scavenges, right? Searches, right? Attaches itself to excess cholesterol esters and molecules and diverts them back to the liver, right? That's HDL. Literally can be too high. Right? LDLs. Now there's different types of LDL, right? We see smooth, sad face, and then smiley face. Well, yeah, it depends on what type of LDL particle we are talking about, right? There's actually type A and type B, right, particles. Again, type A, right, they are very large, kind of buoyant LDL molecules, right? They vary, not all that's the thing, not all LDL cholesterol is bad, or not all LDL cholesterol is associated with any sort of heart disease risk, right? Type B, for sure. Type A, nope, not at all, right? Type A LDL particles are very large. They're very buoyant, right? The odds of them, essentially what kind of happens, right? Let's imagine here is a blood vessel. Right? Let's say I draw the cell. Let's imagine these are the cells lining the wall. What actually happens is different cholesterol esters and plaques can kind of get down underneath. Why is that line there? Come on. All right, there we go. Let's try this again. They get stuck kind of underneath the cell, and it kind of lifts up the cell away from the vessel wall. As that happens, more and more plaquing can begin to accrue. So why does it actually happen to begin with, or why does it happen in the first place? A big part of the reason is diabetes, right? Uncontrolled diabetics, right? High blood glucose levels. That is a huge risk factor for developing, right, atherosclerosis, coronary artery disease, heart disease in general, right? So is high blood pressure. Those are like the tag team, right? When you want to talk about heart disease, hey, how can I give myself heart disease? Well, all right, let's shoot for diabetes and let's shoot for hypertension. Perfect, right? Because remember, in the cardiovascular system from last semester, remember, as we talk about blood traveling through the vessels, when it does so at a increased pressure, it puts increased force on the wall, but it also overly stretches the wall of the blood vessel. Over time, just like if I were to overly stretch, right, a rubber band, it would snap much quicker. That's hypertension, right? It causes the blood vessel wall to have increased amounts of pressure and force exerted against it, so the damage that's occurring to it is occurring at a much more rapid rate. Now that, in conjunction with diabetes, right, or particularly, elevated blood glucose levels, right, which is diabetes. Think of, I've done the demonstration in class before, right? If you want, Go feel a really smooth surface in your house. And then grab some sandpaper. And then scuff up that smooth surface. Right? Then feel it afterwards. Like, oh man, that surface that I scuffed up with the sandpaper is like really rough. Yeah. That's what elevated blood glucose does to the lining of your blood vessels. Literally acts like sandpaper. So when this begins to happen, that's where I mentioned, right, how, I'll draw it a little bigger. Here's a blood vessel, right? When that happens, when there's the damage to the vessel, right? If the vessel is damaged, that's where different cholesterol, plaques, different molecules can get stuck underneath the cell and literally begins to lift the cell up. And when that happens, more and more accumulate, and now we have this beautiful plug in, this beautiful plug in the dam, right? Atherosclerosis. Right now, different types of LDL particles are, right, there are formed, right? Type A, very large, very buoyant. They aren't associated with increased heart disease risk. LDL, right, they're very small, they're very dense. They would fit beautifully underneath the epithelial cells of the blood vessel, and they do, and they absolutely are associated with heart disease, right? And as far as the sources of where they came from, or where they come from, right, the type B particles, right, the small dense particles, come from carbohydrate sources, right? No, I'm not knocking carbohydrates. No, I'm not saying, hey, go run out and go on a ketogenic diet. Not at all. It's not what I'm saying, right? What I'm saying is, hey, you know what? Maybe with the giant bowl of pasta, you shouldn't then have a half a loaf of bread, right? That's what I'm saying as far as the abundance of carbohydrates, right, at one time, because it has to do with the fact, remember, where is this slide, right? Food consumed at too high of a caloric rate for glycogenesis leads to fat deposition, right? In conjunction with that, if it's too high a rate, it leads to fat deposition. The other part of it is because of, if it's just pure, if you're eating a bowl of pasta and with sauce and a loaf of bread, that's 95% carbohydrate. So the amount of glucose that you are ingesting is tremendous. So the rate of glycogenesis has to be occurring at a rapid pace. It can't sustain that. Hence the reason why much of that source gets converted eventually into fatty acids. Right? Now, if you want to, prevent this, adipose tissue from growing or any sort of health deleterious health effect from 90+% carbohydrate intake, become like a high intensity athlete, that sort of thing, right? People, Michael Phelps, back with his training in his peak, probably 10+ years ago. And there were, you can find them, just Google them, but you can find menus of what he used to consume. And he 15,000 calories in a day. I mean, he would just eat massive quantities of stuff, and he could, because that's how much training he was doing. That's how much ATP he was burning on that's how much ATP he was utilizing on a daily basis. Right? But outside of that, right, that sort of level of carbohydrate intake can definitely pose significant problems. VLDL, right? Now, VLDL, right, as of right now, as far as stuff that we know, right, VLDL, very low density, these are just nasty, just bad stuff, right? This isn't any sort of, oh, some of it's good, some of it's bad. Nope, this is problematic. Now, I say it's problematic, but even in saying that, it's one of those things where it is necessary. It's not like, got to get rid of VLDL. We shouldn't ever have it in the body. Well, no, that's not true. We need to have this stuff, and the reason why, triglycerides. I'm just gonna call them triglycerides. These cannot be stored in the liver. All right, cool. Can't be stored in the liver, because if they get stored in the liver, that's where we then develop fatty liver disease. That's a problem. All right. Let's back up for a second. Let's look at this thing. One of the things I had mentioned, and this was going back to digestion, and I also mentioned it last presentation. Your liver's job is to adjust the composition or the concentration of fatty acids in the blood, of amino acids in the blood, of glucose in the blood, hormone levels, etc. That's your liver's responsibility. Through the hepatic portal vein, right, the vast majority of what you eat, the first place it goes to after it's absorbed into the bloodstream, it enters into the portal vein, the hepatic portal vein, and then it goes to the liver. And the liver can adjust the glucose level, it can adjust the fatty acid level, it can adjust the amino acid level, etc. All right, cool. Remember glucose. Well, eventually that can be converted into fatty acids, meaning triglycerides. All right. Now let's move forward to that again. Oops. So in the liver, right, that glucose that we absorbed, let's just imagine it was abundant. It was more than enough than we needed. Eventually it gets converted into triglycerides. Okay, no problem. Because the liver can make the conversion. In order for triglycerides, remember, fatty acids can't just hang out in the blood. They got to have something to piggyback onto. Right? So the way that they do that is these triglycerides piggyback onto a protein, and that's what gives rise to the VLDL. Now, VLDLs, they're not just hanging out in the blood. Right? Their function, their role is to basically carry that triglyceride to adipose tissue to drop it off. Because that triglyceride cannot remain in the liver. It cannot. That's where we start to develop fatty liver disease, whether it's alcoholic or non-alcoholic. Right? Triglycerides can't hang out. Right? With fatty liver disease, right? Whether it's alcoholic or non-alcoholic, there's actually a disruption in your liver's ability to make this conversion from triglycerides to piggyback it onto the protein so it can then become VLDL. There's a disconnect here. So that triglyceride remains in the liver. So hence the reason fatty liver disease, well, yeah, triglyceride, that is fat. So that's where we then have, again, fatty liver disease. So is cholesterol important? Yeah, I'd say so. Right, hormone synthesis. Yeah, any sex hormone, testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, right, cortisol, testosterone, right, all of them are synthesized from cholesterol. Hypothetically, if you didn't have cholesterol, you wouldn't have any of those particular hormones. And yeah, they're kind of important. Right. Plasma membrane repair. Yeah, the reason why our plasma membranes of our cells are fluid, right, they're all kind of bendy and twisty, is because of the presence of the cholesterol. Every single cell, every one of them. So where does it come from? See, the vast majority is synthesized in the liver. Small amount is directly absorbed from the diet. What you eat greatly determines how much the liver synthesizes. Okay. So here's where, there's a lot of, I don't want to say debate, question, a range, right? We say small amount. Anywhere from 10 to 60 is what's quoted in a number of different studies, but the vast majority of them quote somewhere right around, I'll just call it 25% just to make it easy to remember. Right? And even then, come on, what is up with those lines? Damn you, Bill Gates and Microsoft. Dare you. All right, that was weird. All right. So 25%, and really even that's really being generous, right? But just so you know, just so whatever, acknowledging that there is definitely a range as far as what research has shown as far as how much cholesterol we do absorb from the diet. We definitely know it's the minority, right? Definitely the minority of cholesterol. right? And what you eat greatly determines how much your liver synthesizes. So the greater cholesterol that you consume through the diet, right, the less your liver is going to synthesize. And that's the thing. Cholesterol only comes from animal products, right? From animal products. That's it, right? Whether it's the animal meat itself or the product, milk, right, or some sort of dairy product, cheese, right, yogurt, right, whatever, goat milk, whatever it happens to be, right. There isn't any cholesterol in fruits and vegetables, grains. They don't carry any cholesterol, right. So, what type of foods increase its synthesis in the liver? Well, let's think about it. What type of where did the cholesterol come from? Where did we synthesize that cholesterol from? All right, let's back up. All right, so VLDL, even that gave rise to LDL. Huh, okay. So they came from the VLDL. Where'd that come from? Oh, the VLDL, that came from triglyceride. Where'd that come from? That came from glucose. Right now, yes, there was I mentioned in the last presentation, we always think about, oh man, if you eat fats, like those fats then just become fats in the body, albeit that's true some of the time, right? The vast majority of what you eat, right, is going to be converted into glucose, even if it was a fat, right? Large chain fatty acids, right? Sure, they are going to remain large chain. They're eventually going to be absorbed into the lymphatic system to then go dump into the bloodstream via the subclavian vein. However, outside of that, right, let's call it 85+% of what you consume gets converted into glucose. So, the greater level of glucose, especially if it's ingested at too high of a rate that we can't continue to convert it into glycogen, that's where you have elevated level of triglycerides. Elevated level of triglycerides leads to elevated levels of VLDLs. So that's weird. Oh yeah, I forgot to put that there. So I ask again, right? What type of foods increase synthesis in the liver? Again, those high calorically based foods generally that are, right, carbohydrate in nature. Again, it is not carbohydrate. It's not. I'm not anti-carb. I'm not anti-carbs, not at all. It's just the fact that, right, that's the problem why carbohydrate-rich diets lead to a greater synthesis of cholesterol, because when there's a greater fat production, right, when there's a greater level of triglyceride production, that's where we then in turn have a greater level of cholesterol production, right? There are many things there's many things which go into the, I say, benefit or the difference between ingesting some sort of fatty food, butter, cheese, whatever it happens to be, or protein, bologna, pepperoni, meat, whatever it is, compared to that of, refined carbohydrates. Now, the reason why I talk about that is because that's 90% of the carbohydrates that we consume in this country, right, are refined sources. That's why, we talk about when we talk about examples, we're always talking about the majority. I'd say 9 out of 10 cases, oh yeah, that signifies, that deems that's the majority, right? So because of the fact that they are, right, refined carbohydrates, right, that's what the big kicker is. Because as I mentioned last class, right, because of the fact that they're refined, the bulk of nutrients and really more importantly the bulk of the fiber content has been removed. So when the fiber content has been removed, that's what causes the increased pace in which that glucose is absorbed. Right, so because it increases the pace in which it's absorbed, that means that now we've ingested more glucose then we are able to convert into glycogen, so we've got to get blood glucose levels down, so now we start to convert it into adipose tissue. All right. So again, the hormonal influences of this, again, the biggest one, insulin. Right, that's the number one, that's the big guy. Right, this is what's going to cause your body to store blood glucose in the form of 1, glycogen, and then 2, triglycerides. This slide here, right, this is, let me kind of look at this. Triglycerides, glycerol, fatty acids, glucose, amino acids, acetyl-CoA, Krebs cycle. So these things here, lipolysis and lipogenesis. Lipogenesis, that's what we just talked about when insulin stimulates the production of fatty acids. Or I might say by fatty acids, I mean it stimulates the production of triglycerides, because triglycerides then get stored as fat tissue or adipose tissue. We can see insulin causes the conversion of glyceride, right, 3-phosphate. Eventually, we're going to have that. Remember that glycerone phosphate we had in the glycolysis? Where eventually that's going to lead to triglycerides. The same thing that's going to happen the same thing happens for those particular amino acids that get created in glycolysis. Remember, glycolysis, at the end of glycolysis, rendered the amino acid pyruvic acid or pyruvate. That pyruvate then got converted into acetyl-CoA. Now, I mentioned if acetyl-CoA, if we have an abundance of ATP, we've got too many, eventually citrate, because remember, acetyl-CoA gets converted into citrate thanks to citrate synthase. That citrate gets kicked out of the mitochondria, and it too gets converted into triglycerides. Again, that is the responsibility, or that is what insulin is going to stimulate. The opposite is true for epinephrine, right, or cortisol, for instance. Glucagon even, right? They function to elevate blood glucose levels. So we want to convert triglycerides into a glycerol head, because that glycerol head can be converted into glucose. At the same token, those fatty acid tails can undergo a process called beta oxidation, and that's where they can then become acetyl-CoA. Right, so that's one of the, I don't want to say the benefits, but that's one of the characteristics of fats, is that these fats can enter into, right, the fats in and of themselves can enter into the Krebs cycle. Right, so that's where, right, the idea that, oh, you've got to consume. Again, I am not touting a no carb diet, not at all. But that's where, right, the idea, I'm big on like kind of, whatever, pointing facts, telling truths, kind of pointing out things that people say and it's just nonsense, right? People talk about, oh, you've got to eat carbohydrates. If you don't, you'll die. Well, I mean, no. Right? If there weren't any carbohydrates in the body, you would die. But the kicker is your body, right, because of the triglyceride, there's the glycerol head, right, and the 3 fatty tails, right? It's a really ugly fatty acid, but I'll take it. Right. That glycerol portion, this here, that gets converted, that in itself can get converted back into glucose. Oh, so that portion of the triglyceride can actually be converted back into glucose, and it is. But at the same token, without carbohydrates, how I mentioned you'd be dead, absolutely. Because the fatty acids, they think of them as kind of a terrible circle, right? The fatty acids, right, these here, they burn in the carbohydrate fire, meaning, right, like this glucose, right, gets converted into pyruvate, which then gets converted into acetyl-CoA. So without the presence of glucose, there wouldn't be these other precursors which were already necessary, right? Again, if you go back to that slide from the 10 or so slides ago, you can see how even with fatty acids, there has to be the presence of glucose in order for both to work, right? So again, it's not so much, oh, yay, pro-fats or yay, pro-carbs. You're pro both. It's just the ratio in which you consume them both. That's the issue. Okay, so leaving us off here is protein metabolism. And we're actually not going to go any further. I see it's an hour and 15, so we're up for this particular class. But picking up next presentation, we will be looking at protein metabolism. Right, we're going to be looking at the actual absorption of proteins, how it is that proteins differ from carbohydrates, for instance, how proteins differ from fatty acids, for instance. Right, so that's where we'll pick up on next Tuesday. Everybody take care. Have a great weekend.